The saddest mistakes are never made in anger. They are made when we stop listening to the people who love us. On the highest floor of the Hayes Grand Hotel, workers rushed across polished marble floors carrying flowers, crystal glasses, and elegant decorations for what newspapers were already calling the event of the year. Benjamin Hayes stood alone beside the enormous windows overlooking the lights of New York City. The celebration below had been planned for months. His company had broken every financial record. Investors from around the country were flying in, and the evening was supposed to mark the beginning of a new chapter for the billionaire whose name had become a symbol of success. Yet as he watched the traffic moving far below, he felt a strange emptiness that no achievement seemed able to fill. His assistant entered quietly and placed a stack of invitations on the desk. "Everything is ready, Mr. Hayes. There is only one final guest list confirmation." Benjamin nodded without looking away from the window. He had spent 5 years building an empire after his divorce, working longer hours than anyone around him, convincing himself that success could replace the life he had left behind. People often described him as brilliant, disciplined, and impossible to distract. They did not know that every evening, before leaving his office, he unlocked a small wooden drawer hidden behind old business files. Inside rested a faded photograph of a smiling young woman standing beside a tiny garden filled with white roses. Naomi Carter had never cared about expensive cars or private jets. She had loved old books, rainy afternoons, and simple dinners shared on the back porch of their first little house. She used to tell him that a family was built one quiet moment at a time. Benjamin had laughed then, believing there would always be more time. The phone on his desk suddenly rang, pulling him back to the present. It was Chloe Mitchell, his longtime business partner. "Tonight is going to be perfect," she said confidently. "Everyone important will be there." Benjamin forced a polite smile even though she could not see him. "I hope so." After the call ended, he opened the wooden drawer once more. The photograph was still there, along with a folded piece of paper that had become worn around the edges. He had never been able to throw it away. It was the last note Naomi had left on the kitchen table before walking out of his life. He had never unfolded it after that day because he believed he already knew what it would say. Outside the hotel, delivery trucks lined the street while reporters gathered behind security barriers. The city was waiting for a glamorous celebration. Inside a quiet little bookstore nearly 200 miles away, Naomi stood on a wooden ladder placing books back onto a shelf after closing time. Her life had become simple, peaceful, and far removed from the world she had once known. Just as she reached for the last book, she noticed an envelope resting on the front counter. There was no return address. Only her name was written across the front in careful handwriting. Naomi slowly opened it and found a single invitation printed on thick white paper. It invited her to attend the Hayes Foundation Gala the following evening. She stared at the card for a long moment before quietly placing it beside an old wooden box she had promised herself she would never open again. Naomi Carter sat alone inside the little bookstore long after the last customer had gone home. Outside, the streets of the quiet coastal town had already fallen into silence, and the old clock above the front door slowly ticked through the evening. The invitation remained on the wooden counter exactly where she had placed it. Thick white paper, elegant black lettering, and one familiar name that she had spent 5 years trying to forget. Hayes Foundation Annual Gala. She reached for the card again, turning it over in her hands as though it might reveal why someone had sent it. There was no personal message, no explanation, only a date, a time, and a place that belonged to a life she had left behind. Her eyes slowly drifted toward the old wooden box resting beside the register. It was not expensive or beautifully carved. In fact, the corners had become worn over the years, and the brass latch had faded with age. She had carried it with her every time she moved, promising herself that one day she would throw it away. Yet somehow she never could. Naomi unlocked the latch and carefully lifted the lid. Inside rested a handful of simple memories. A dried white rose from the tiny garden she and Benjamin had planted behind their first house. A receipt from a small diner where they used to eat breakfast every Sunday. A movie ticket from the first date they almost missed because of the rain. Beneath those little treasures lay a framed photograph of 2 young people smiling at each other as though nothing in the world could ever separate them. Benjamin was wearing an old denim jacket instead of an expensive suit, and Naomi was laughing because he had accidentally spilled coffee on his own shoes. Back then they had almost nothing, but she remembered feeling richer than she ever had since. She gently picked up the photograph and smiled sadly. Success had not changed Benjamin overnight. At first, it had simply meant longer workdays and bigger responsibilities. Then came the endless meetings, business trips, and elegant parties where she never felt comfortable. She had tried to support him because she believed love meant growing together. But somewhere along the way, conversations became shorter, dinners became colder, and silence slowly filled the spaces where laughter used to live. The hardest part was not that he became successful. The hardest part was realizing that he had stopped noticing the little things that once mattered to both of them. Naomi reached deeper into the box and found another folded piece of paper. It was the letter she had written on the day she left. She remembered placing it on the kitchen table beside his coffee cup before quietly closing the front door behind her. She had hoped he would read it and understand that she was not leaving because she had stopped loving him. She was leaving because she could no longer recognize the man she had married. 5 years had passed, yet the letter remained folded exactly as she had left it. Tears quietly gathered in her eyes as she realized he had probably never opened it at all. She carefully placed everything back into the wooden box and closed the lid. Then she looked once more at the invitation. Outside, the wind gently moved the branches of the old maple tree standing in front of the bookstore. Naomi walked to the window and stared into the darkness. She had built a peaceful life surrounded by books, flowers, and kind neighbors who knew nothing about billionaires or grand hotels. She had finally learned how to live without looking back. Yet somewhere deep inside her heart, one question refused to disappear. If Benjamin had truly forgotten her, then who had sent the invitation that had found its way across 200 miles and 5 silent years to reach her little bookstore? The following morning, Benjamin Hayes arrived at the ballroom before sunrise, even though the gala would not begin until evening. Workers climbed ladders to adjust thousands of tiny lights hanging from the ceiling, while florists arranged white roses across long tables covered in linen. Reporters had already started gathering outside the hotel, hoping to catch a glimpse of celebrities and business leaders who would soon arrive. Everyone around him seemed excited, but Benjamin could not shake the strange feeling that something important was missing. He slowly walked through the enormous hall, listening to the quiet echoes of his footsteps. Years ago, Naomi used to tell him that large rooms only felt beautiful when they were filled with people who truly cared about one another. At the time, he had laughed and promised that one day he would throw her the most beautiful celebration the city had ever seen. Looking around now, he realized he had built exactly that, yet the one person he had wanted to share it with was gone. His assistant approached carrying a folder filled with final schedules. "The guest list has been confirmed," she said. "Every invitation has been accepted except for one. We never received a reply from Naomi Carter." Benjamin stood perfectly still. He had not spoken her name out loud in years. Slowly, he looked toward the large windows overlooking the city. "I never approved sending that invitation," he said quietly. His assistant looked confused. "It was included with the original guest list from 5 years ago. The foundation office has always kept it active." Benjamin said nothing more. After she walked away, he found himself wondering if some small part of him had been hoping all these years that Naomi would someday walk back into his life. Across the state, Naomi opened the bookstore as she always did. The little brass bell above the front door rang softly as customers came and went. Children sat in the reading corner, while older neighbors stopped by for coffee and conversation. To everyone around her, she looked calm and content. Only she knew that her thoughts kept returning to the invitation resting inside the wooden box beneath the counter. During lunch, an elderly customer named Mrs. Patterson noticed Naomi staring through the window. The kind old woman smiled gently. "Sometimes life gives us one more chance to say the things we never said." Naomi looked down at her hands. "What if it is too late?" Mrs. Patterson slowly closed the book she had been reading. "Then you go anyway, because peace is worth more than regret." That evening, after locking the bookstore, Naomi carried the wooden box home. She placed it on the kitchen table and carefully opened it once again. Beneath the old photograph and the dried white rose was a tiny silver key. She had almost forgotten it existed. The key belonged to a small drawer inside the desk Benjamin had built for her during their first year of marriage. She remembered watching him sand the rough edges with his own hands because he wanted everything to be perfect. Inside that hidden drawer, she used to keep letters they wrote to each other whenever life became too busy for long conversations. Naomi quietly closed her eyes. She wondered if the desk still existed or if it had disappeared along with everything else they had once shared. At nearly the same moment, hundreds of miles away, Benjamin returned to his office after the final gala preparations were complete. Without really knowing why, he unlocked the old wooden drawer behind his business files and reached inside. His hand touched a small silver key that had remained there untouched for 5 years. He stared at it for a long moment before slowly realizing that he still had one. Half of something they had once promised never to lose. The silver key felt heavier in Benjamin Hayes's hand than it should have. He sat alone in his office long after everyone had left the Hayes Grand Hotel, the city lights stretching endlessly beyond the glass walls. The gala preparations were complete, yet for the first time in years, success no longer felt like an achievement. It felt like silence. He turned the key slowly between his fingers, remembering the last time he had seen it. Naomi had placed it inside a small drawer in the desk he built for her, calling it their letter place, a space where they promised to always speak honestly even when they could not speak in person. Benjamin stood up abruptly and walked toward the old wooden desk in the corner of his office. It was not part of the modern design of the building. He had insisted on keeping it after the divorce, though even he had never admitted why. He knelt beside it and opened the hidden drawer. Inside lay nothing but dust, a few faded envelopes, and a small note written in Naomi's handwriting. His breath slowed as he picked it up. The words were simple, but they carried a weight he had never been prepared to face. She had written about feeling unseen, not unloved, but slowly forgotten in the noise of his growing world. She had not accused him. She had only described the quiet distance that had grown between them like a wall neither of them knew how to break. Benjamin closed his eyes. For years he had believed she left because she no longer wanted their life. Now he realized she had left because she no longer felt like part of it. At the same time, miles away, Naomi sat at her kitchen table holding the same key. She had not used it in years, yet her hands remembered the shape of it, as if no time had passed at all. She placed it beside the invitation and the wooden box, feeling a strange tension between past and present pulling her in opposite directions. Outside her window, the small coastal town remained quiet, but inside her mind, memories were no longer distant. They were close enough to touch. She thought about Benjamin standing in a room filled with people who admired him, yet somehow, still alone. She had once believed leaving was the only way to protect what remained of her heart. But now she wondered if silence had protected anything at all, or if it had simply frozen both of them in the moment everything broke. Benjamin finally stood and looked at his reflection in the dark glass of the office window. The man staring back at him looked unchanged on the surface, but something behind his eyes had shifted. He had spent years building things that could be measured, counted, and displayed. Yet none of it explained the emptiness that now filled the space where certainty used to live. He turned back toward the desk and carefully placed the silver key into his pocket. For the first time since the divorce, he did not think about closing another deal or managing another empire. He thought about a woman who had once told him that love was not built in grand moments, but in the quiet decision to stay present even when life became complicated. Naomi rose from her chair and looked at the invitation once more. The gala was no longer just an event on paper. It had become something else entirely, a line between what had been lost and what might still remain. She gently closed the wooden box and whispered to herself that some doors were never meant to stay locked forever. And somewhere in the silence between two lives that had drifted apart, the same question quietly formed on both sides of the distance. What happens when the past finally knocks again, and this time, refuses to be ignored? The morning of the Hayes Foundation Gala arrived with an unusual stillness in the city. For Benjamin Hayes, it felt less like the beginning of a celebration and more like the approach of something he could no longer avoid. He stood in front of the mirror inside his private suite at the hotel, adjusting a tie he did not truly need to fix. The reflection staring back at him looked composed, successful, and carefully controlled, but behind that surface was a growing uncertainty he had not felt in years. On the other side of the city, Naomi Carter sat by the window of her small bookstore, holding the invitation once again. She had not decided whether she would attend yet. Her hands kept returning to it, as if the answer was already written somewhere between the lines. The wooden box rested open beside her, the silver key lying on top of the folded letter she had once written and never expected to matter again. She thought about the quiet life she had built, the comfort of familiar routines, and the distance she had carefully maintained from the world she once shared with Benjamin. Yet nothing about this invitation felt accidental. It felt like a door that had been unlocked long before she noticed. As evening approached, Benjamin arrived at the grand ballroom, where final preparations were underway. Crystal lights shimmered above polished floors, and guests began arriving in elegant attire, filling the space with conversation and anticipation. Chloe Mitchell stood beside him, speaking confidently about the success of the night, but Benjamin barely heard her. His attention drifted to every entrance, every movement, every possibility that might lead to something unexpected. He checked his watch more than once, though he did not know what exactly he was waiting for. At the same time, Naomi stood in front of her mirror at home, wearing a simple dark dress she had chosen without assistance. She did not try to transform herself into someone else. Instead, she focused on simply being present in the moment she had delayed for so long. She placed the silver key into her pocket and closed the wooden box carefully. Before leaving, she paused for a long moment, listening to the quiet of the house that had become her refuge. It felt like saying goodbye to safety without knowing what would replace it. When Naomi finally arrived at the Hayes Grand Hotel, she stood for a moment outside the towering glass doors. The lights from inside spilled onto the sidewalk, mixing with the night air and the sound of distant music. She could see silhouettes moving behind the glass, people who belonged to a world that had once felt far away from her. Taking a slow breath, she stepped forward. Inside, Benjamin turned slightly, as if sensing a change in the room before anyone spoke her name. The conversations around him seemed to fade into background noise as his eyes slowly moved toward the entrance. And then he saw her. Naomi Carter stood quietly near the doorway, not searching for attention, not trying to announce her presence, simply standing as if she had every right to be there even after all these years. For a brief moment, the entire ballroom seemed to lose its sound. Benjamin did not move. He did not speak. He only stared, as if time itself had chosen that exact second to stop. The woman he had spent 5 years trying to forget had not arrived as a memory. She had arrived as something real, something he could no longer ignore, and in that silence, the past and present finally collided in a way neither of them was prepared for. The moment Naomi Carter stepped fully inside the Hayes Grand Hotel, the world she had carefully stayed away from for 5 years closed in around her like a memory that had suddenly become physical again. The grand chandelier above the lobby shimmered with golden light, and the sound of soft music drifted from the ballroom ahead. Guests turned their heads slightly as she passed, some recognizing her, others sensing only that something significant had just changed the atmosphere of the evening. Naomi did not look for Benjamin Hayes immediately. Instead, she paused for a brief moment beside a tall glass wall that reflected her image alongside the moving crowd behind her. For a second, she saw the woman she used to be standing next to the woman she had become, and neither felt distant anymore. Inside the ballroom, Benjamin stood frozen in place. He had seen countless business deals, global announcements, and public ceremonies, yet nothing had ever silenced a room the way Naomi's presence did. Chloe Mitchell leaned slightly toward him, whispering something about continuing the program, but he did not respond. His attention remained locked on the entrance where she had appeared. Slowly, Naomi walked forward, not rushing, not hesitating, simply moving as if she had already accepted that this moment was meant to happen. 5 years of silence seemed to compress into each step she took. As she reached the center of the room, conversations faded completely. Benjamin finally moved, taking one step forward as if trying to confirm she was real. Their eyes met across the polished floor, and in that instant, neither wealth nor pride mattered. Only time did. Naomi spoke first, her voice calm but steady. "I received your invitation." It was not an accusation, not a question, just a truth placed carefully into the space between them. Benjamin swallowed hard, as though every speech he had ever delivered had suddenly left him without words. "I did not know it was sent," he replied quietly. Around them, guests began to realize this was not part of the evening's program. This was something else entirely. A story that had begun long before the ballroom lights were turned on. Naomi held the silver key inside her pocket, but did not take it out. Instead, she looked at him with a calmness that surprised even herself. "Why now?" she asked. The question carried no anger, only the weight of 5 years lived separately. Benjamin hesitated. For the first time in years, he did not answer like a businessman calculating the safest response. "Because I realized success did not mean anything without understanding what I lost," he said honestly. A quiet tension filled the room. Chloe stepped forward slightly, attempting to regain control of the situation, but Benjamin raised a hand gently, signaling that nothing else mattered in that moment. He took another step toward Naomi, stopping just a few feet away. Up close, he could see the details time had not erased. The same eyes that once looked at him with trust now carried distance, but not bitterness. That realization struck him harder than any failure he had ever faced. Naomi finally spoke again, softer this time. "You built everything you said you wanted." Benjamin shook his head slowly. "I built everything except the one thing that mattered." Silence returned, heavier than before. Guests no longer whispered. Even the music seemed distant. Naomi looked down for a moment, then back at him. "I did not come here to revisit the past," she said. "I came because I needed to know if I still felt anything when I saw you." Benjamin's expression changed subtly. "And do you?" he asked. Naomi did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked around the room filled with light, people, and expectations, then back at him. "I feel like I finally understand why I left," she said quietly. "Not because I stopped loving you, but because I stopped recognizing myself beside you." The words settled between them like something final, yet unfinished. Benjamin closed his eyes briefly, as if accepting a truth he had avoided for years. When he opened them again, he no longer looked like a man trying to control an empire. He looked like someone standing at the edge of everything he had built, realizing for the first time that none of it could bring her back unless she chose to stay. And in that realization, the night that was meant to celebrate success quietly became something else entirely, the beginning of a conversation neither of them could afford to ignore any longer. The silence inside the ballroom did not last because people were trying to understand what was happening. It lasted because no one wanted to interrupt it. Benjamin Hayes stood only a few feet away from Naomi Carter, yet the distance between them felt far greater than the entire room they were standing in. The lights above continued to glow softly, and the orchestra had lowered their music without being asked, as if even they recognized that something more important than celebration was unfolding. Naomi kept her posture calm, but inside she felt the weight of every year that had passed since she last saw him in a space like this. Benjamin finally broke his gaze away from her face and looked down briefly, as if gathering strength from somewhere deep inside himself. "I did not expect you to come," he said quietly. Naomi responded without emotion, not coldly, but carefully. "I almost did not." That simple sentence carried more truth than anything either of them had said that night. Around them, guests began to slowly step back, giving space without being asked. Chloe Mitchell stood near the edge of the crowd, her expression shifting from confusion to discomfort as she realized she no longer controlled the narrative of the evening. Benjamin took another step closer, lowering his voice. "I do not deserve this moment," he said. Naomi looked at him for a long time before answering. "No," she said gently, "you do not." The honesty in her voice made him close his eyes for a brief second. There was no anger in her words, only acceptance, and somehow that was more difficult to face. When he opened his eyes again, he spoke more quietly. "I thought I was doing everything right after you left. I told myself I was building something meaningful. I told myself I was moving forward." Naomi listened without interrupting. She had heard versions of this in her own mind for years, but hearing it from him felt different. "And were you?" she asked. Benjamin shook his head slowly. "No, I was only moving faster so I would not have to think about what I lost." The ballroom remained still. Even conversations at the far edges of the room had faded completely. Naomi finally looked away from him for a moment, scanning the faces around them. Some of them had once judged her quietly, others had never known her at all. Now they all watched in silence, as if witnessing something fragile that could break with a single wrong word. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. "Do you know what hurt the most?" Benjamin did not answer immediately. "It was not the distance," she continued. It was realizing that I became invisible inside a life I helped build. Benjamin's expression tightened slightly, not from defense, but from recognition. He had no response that could undo what she had just said. After a long pause, he asked, "Is there anything I can do now?" Naomi did not answer right away. Instead, she reached into her pocket and slowly held the silver key between her fingers. The gesture caught his attention immediately. He recognized it before she even spoke. "This belonged to us," she said quietly. "And for a long time, I thought it still did." She stepped forward slightly and placed the key on a nearby table, not as a rejection, but as closure. "I came here because I needed to see if I felt anger," she added. "But I do not. I feel something worse. I feel nothing where there used to be something important." Benjamin stared at the key, then at her. "Is that all there is left?" he asked. Naomi hesitated for the first time that night. "No," she said softly. "There is also understanding. And understanding means I finally see why it had to end." Benjamin's shoulders lowered slightly, as if something inside him had finally given up trying to resist the truth. He looked around the room filled with wealth, success, and admiration, and for the first time, none of it mattered. "I wish I had understood sooner," he said. Naomi gave a small, almost invisible nod. "So do I," she replied. And in that shared regret, without apology or forgiveness, something between them quietly reached its final shape, not a reunion, but the end of a chapter neither of them could return to anymore. After the silver key was placed on the table, a deep silence settled over the ballroom that felt different from before. It was no longer the silence of anticipation or confusion. It was the silence of something ending in real time, with no audience able to intervene. Naomi Carter stood still for a moment longer, as if confirming that everything she needed to say had already been said without needing more words. Benjamin Hayes remained where he was, watching her, not with the confidence of a billionaire CEO, but with the quiet uncertainty of a man realizing that no amount of success could rewrite what had already been lost. Naomi finally stepped back slightly, creating a space between them that felt final rather than temporary. "I do not hate you," she said softly, her voice steady but distant. "That is what I came here to understand." Benjamin looked at her, searching for something in her expression that might suggest another chance. But there was no anger to negotiate with, no pain to repair, only acceptance that had already settled long before this moment. "And now?" he asked quietly. Naomi took a slow breath, as if choosing her words carefully. "Now I go back to the life I built after you," she said. "A life I am finally at peace with." The words landed gently but firmly, carrying the weight of closure rather than conflict. Around them, the guests of the gala remained frozen in polite silence, as if unsure whether they were witnessing a reunion or a farewell. Chloe Mitchell stepped forward slightly, but stopped when she realized no part of this moment belonged to her anymore. Benjamin lowered his gaze for a moment, then looked back at Naomi with a softness that had not been present when she had first entered the room. "If I had known," he began, then paused, as if realizing how empty those words sounded even as he said them. Naomi shook her head gently. "You did not know because you were not listening," she replied without cruelty. "And I did not stay because I stopped waiting to be heard." There was no bitterness in her tone, only clarity, as if she had finally understood the shape of her own past without needing to change it. Benjamin exhaled slowly. The reality of her words was heavier than anything he had faced in business or reputation. "Is there anything I can do now?" he asked again, more quietly than before. Naomi looked at him for a long moment. This time, her silence was not hesitation. It was completion. "No," she said at last. "There is nothing to fix anymore." She turned her eyes briefly toward the silver key resting on the table between them. It no longer looked like a symbol of connection. It looked like the final piece of something that had already ended. "Some things are not broken," she added. "They simply reach their end." Benjamin nodded slightly, as though accepting a truth that had taken years to arrive. For the first time since the night began, he did not try to hold on. Naomi stepped back once more, then turned slightly toward the exit. She did not leave in anger, and she did not leave in sadness. She left with the same quiet strength she had carried when she first walked into the hotel. As she moved through the ballroom, guests instinctively stepped aside, not because of status or fear, but because something about her presence no longer invited interruption. Benjamin watched her go without following, his reflection faintly visible in the glass walls behind him. The man who had built an empire stood still inside a moment he could not influence, realizing that the most important thing he had ever lost had not been taken from him by time or distance, but by his own failure to understand it when it mattered most. When the doors finally closed behind Naomi, the sound echoed softly through the ballroom like the closing of a chapter no one would reopen. And in that echo, Benjamin Hayes understood that some realizations do not arrive to save a story. They arrive only to end it. The ballroom remained filled for several minutes after Naomi Carter left, yet no one resumed the celebration as it was originally intended. The music played softly in the background, but it felt distant, almost irrelevant, as if the evening itself had shifted into something quieter and more reflective. Benjamin Hayes stood alone near the center of the room, no longer surrounded by conversations or expectations. The silver key still rested on the table where Naomi had placed it, catching the reflection of the chandelier above. He did not touch it at first. Instead, he simply looked at it, as though trying to understand how something so small could carry so much finality. Slowly, he walked toward it and picked it up. The metal felt cold in his hand, unchanged by time, unlike everything else that had shifted beyond recognition. He remembered the way Naomi had spoken, not with anger, but with certainty. That certainty had been more powerful than any argument, more permanent than any regret he had ever experienced. Across the city, Naomi walked through the quiet streets toward her car without looking back at the hotel. The night air was cool and steady, carrying the faint sound of distant traffic. She did not cry, and she did not rush. Each step forward felt deliberate, as if she were finally walking in a direction that belonged entirely to her. When she reached her vehicle, she paused briefly with her hand on the door. For a moment, she thought about the years she had spent waiting for understanding that never came, and how strange it felt to no longer need it. She got inside and closed the door gently, the sound barely audible against the silence of the night. Back inside the Hayes Grand Hotel, Benjamin returned to the private office adjacent to the ballroom. The celebration continued around him in a muted form, but he had already stepped out of it emotionally. He placed the silver key on his desk and sat down, staring at it as though it were no longer an object, but a question he would spend the rest of his life trying to answer. His assistant entered quietly, unsure whether to speak. "The guests are asking if you will return," she said carefully. Benjamin did not look up. "Tell them the evening is over," he replied. She hesitated, sensing something had changed, then quietly left the room. Alone again, Benjamin leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. For the first time in years, he did not think about meetings, companies, or future expansions. Instead, he thought about a small house with a garden, a woman laughing softly while placing books on a shelf, and a life that had once felt too simple for him to appreciate. He realized that everything he had built after her departure had been designed to fill a space that could not be replaced by success. It could only have been filled by presence, patience, and understanding, all of which he had not recognized in time. Naomi, meanwhile, arrived back at her bookstore and stood inside the quiet space before turning on the lights. The familiar shelves, the worn wooden counter, and the scent of paper and ink surrounded her like a steady reminder of who she had become. She placed her hand on the wooden box one last time, but did not open it. Instead, she slid the silver key inside and closed it gently. She no longer saw it as something unfinished. She saw it as something complete. In the days that followed, neither of them reached out. There were no dramatic gestures, no sudden attempts to rewrite what had already settled into history. Instead, there was distance, reflection, and the slow acceptance that not every story is meant to be reopened. Some stories exist only to be understood after they end. And in that understanding, both Benjamin Hayes and Naomi Carter began to learn the same quiet truth in separate worlds. That love, when lost through neglect rather than hate, does not demand correction. It simply demands acknowledgement, and then, eventually, release.